I want to make it clear. If Bernie's a nominee, I will not only support him, I will campaign for him. And I believe the people who support me will do the same thing. Because the existential threat to the United States of America is Donald Trump. We fundamentally disagree with this president on everything.
Well, obviously, I hope to win the nomination. But if I don't win the nomination, and I think every other Democratic candidate is prepared to come together to do everything humanly possible to defeat Donald Trump.
So there you have it, at least in part. Welcome to The Real News. I'm Mark Steiner. Great to have you with us. Now, while the battle for the soul of the Democrats and a vision for the future is being waged, there seems to hopefully be a sense of unity when it comes to ending the white nationalist and neoconservative takeover of this country. We'll see if those comments actually come to fruition and what they really mean. Last night's, as many people are calling it, Corona debate, was illustrative of the battle that Democrats are playing out in the primary between this neoliberal pragmatist wing who thinks the system is sound and those who see the need to deal with the emergency at hand, but knowing we need systemic change. This debate changed no one's mind, I think, and neither Biden nor Bernie won last night. They had their moments. If you came in watching and leaned one way or the other, your position probably didn't change. Sanders' ideas are taking hold, but most Democrats seem to support the pragmatist. Will Sanders push the party left? Can they beat Trump? From the coronavirus to climate crisis and the elite red baiting we saw, we'll examine all that in this conversation about what happened last night with our guest, Sonali Kolhatkar, who joins us. She's host and executive producer of Rising Up with Sonali, an award-winning journalist of this nationally syndicated program. She's also a weekly columnist at Truthdig and author of Bleeding Afghanistan, Washington Warlords, and the Propaganda of Silence. And Sonali, welcome. Great to have you with us.
Thank you so much, Mark.
And I'm glad we could play that piece that you did the other week. It was a really great program, and I look forward to many more collaborations with you and your work.
Same here.
So let's begin here. My coronavirus is on everybody's mind. So before we take a deep dive in the politics of last night, I think it's important to kind of look at what went back and forth in that particular issue that faces us all at the moment.
This coronavirus pandemic exposes the incredible weakness and dysfunctionality of our current healthcare system. Now, we're spending twice as much per person on healthcare as the people of any other country. In the midst of this epidemic, you got people in the pharmaceutical industry who are saying, oh, wow, what an opportunity to make a fortune. So the word has got to go out, and I certainly would do this as president. You don't worry, people of America, do not worry about the cost of prescription drugs. Do not worry about the cost of the health care that you're going to get, because we are a nation, a civilized, democratic society. Everybody, rich and poor, middle class, will get the care they need. The drug companies will not rip us off.
And with all due respect to Medicare for all, you have a single-payer system in Italy. It doesn't work there. It has nothing to do with Medicare for all. That would not solve the problem at all. We can take care of that right now by making sure that no one has to pay for treatment, period, because of the crisis. No one has to pay for whatever drugs are needed, period, because of the crisis. No one has to pay for hospitalization because of the crisis, period.
Bottom line here is, in terms of Medicare for all, despite what the vice president is saying, what the experts tell us is that one of the reasons that we are unprepared and have been unprepared is we don't have a system. We got thousands of private insurance plans. That is not a system that is prepared to provide health care to all people.
So now there we have it. I think in some ways that's the pragmatist versus systemic change.
I think Joe Biden was really disingenuous during this debate around the coronavirus issue. He has tried really hard to, I guess, speak to what voters really want. Time after time, we see voters want, are concerned about healthcare. It's a top issue. And this coronavirus disaster that we're in the middle of has highlighted that now more than ever. So Joe Biden decided to try to have it both ways, which is if you are, need to get tested around the coronavirus or you find out you have it, you won't be on the hook for any payments. And we're supposed to feel, lucky that we have a former vice presidential candidate who suggests this. But then what if we're unlucky enough to get the seasonal flu or cancer or diabetes? Then we have to worry about the co-pays if we're even lucky enough to be insured. Sanders, of course, said something similar, which is that people should not have to worry about paying for anything. But he also wants to see a long-term vision for a nationalized health plan, taxpayer-funded single-payer plan, which makes so much more sense. Biden, you played the clip. Biden said, "Well, Italy doesn't have has single-payer, and it didn't work." And that was, I thought, really also misleading. The reason why Italy is in its crisis right now is because they didn't practice social distancing early enough, not because they have a single-payer healthcare system.
As a matter of fact, if you look at what's happening in Italy now, it's because they have that system, they can coordinate things in ways we cannot at this very moment. I mean, that's a piece of this. It also kind of shows, before we show this next piece here, that I think gets to the heart of this political divide that's taking place inside the Democrats, is that you're also seeing this kind of play out in terms of how they view where the future is going to go and where most Democrats think. Many people look at this and say most Democrats will back Biden because at this moment people think we need a pragmatist, not somebody who's looking for wholesale change. How do you answer that? How do you respond to that? How do we respond to that?
Well, in his pragmatism, Biden said just a few days ago on an MSNBC interview that if a single-payer healthcare system was actually miraculously passed by Congress, if he was president, he would still veto it. I was very disappointed that Sanders didn't bring that up during last night's debate. But if you're talking about pragmatism, then you can't just be thinking in the short term. On the short term, they both agreed that everything should be free of charge to Americans. The long-term vision, which is truly important if we're talking about wanting to be pragmatist about this, is what do we want our healthcare system to look like? Biden's answer is Obamacare and strengthening it. But this is, we've been down this path before. Obamacare was an improvement on what we had before, but we still had tens of millions of uninsured Americans. That's not pragmatism. That's not practical. And I think the Democrats are once more pulling the wool over people's eyes and telling Americans 4 more years, give us 4 more years of pragmatism and put off your thoughts of rebuilding the system, which is really what Sanders means by a political revolution. He doesn't mean, guns in the streets, tearing down the government. He means, which sometimes I wish he would sort of clarify, because those words sound scary to Americans. And so I think by using the word political revolution as opposed to a revolution, he's trying to clarify that. But I think it's absolutely impractical for us to try to bring things to where they were before Trump, which is what Biden is promising.
So as our friend Jeet here, who writes for The Nation, said, he was talking about how this debate it really clarified the difference between Sanders and Biden on political philosophy. And I think that's really important. But let's watch how that plays itself out in this clip that actually we got from Jeet's article, where he kind of delineated this for all of us. Let's look at this.
People are looking for results, not a revolution. They want to deal with the results they need right now. And we can do that by making sure that we make everybody whole who has been so badly hurt in terms of they lose the job, in terms of not having the ability to care for their children, in terms of the healthcare costs that they have related to this crisis. We can make them whole now. That has nothing to do with the legitimate concern about income equality in America. That's real. That's real. But that does not affect the need for us to act swiftly and very thoroughly and in concert with all the forces that we need to bring to bear to deal with the crisis now. So no one's thrown out of their home. No one loses their mortgage. No one is kicked out of their house. No one loses their paycheck. No one is in a position where they have a significant financial disability as a consequence of this of this particular crisis.
It is not good enough not to be understanding how we got here and where we want to go into the future. So how does it happen that today, in the wealthiest country in the history of the world, half of our people are scared to death? But God willing, this crisis is going to end. And we are going to have to develop an economy in which half of our people are not living paycheck to paycheck and struggling to put food on the table.
So let's get into a little deeper about where this divide takes place. I mean, one of the things that neither brought up last night, even though I think Sanders attempted to bring up in a broader sense, was when you look at this congressional package that just happened, that the deal between the White House and the Democrats in Congress, is it leaves out, when it talks about paid leave and sick leave, it leaves out 80% of American workers. It puts McDonald's and all these other companies off the hook. Amazon, they don't have to pay for their health care for their workers while they're off. I mean, this is something that needs to be at the heart of this debate, I think, about what this means and how to fight it and how to deal with it.
Absolutely. The bill that the Democrats came together with the White House on Friday exempts companies who have more than 500 employees, which is basically most big corporations, if not all big corporations. I mean, 500 is a very low number, especially for the Walmarts and the Targets of this country. These are the same companies who whose executives Trump proudly stood beside in the face of a pandemic. It was, essentially promoting these corporatists. But I think you're right. I wish Sanders had brought that up during the debate, that this bill was wholly inadequate. Paid sick leave is exactly linked to, and the lack of it is linked to the income inequality that Biden was trying desperately to disentangle and separate from why so much of the country is economically insecure today. Why are most Americans, not able to withstand a $400 emergency expense because of income inequality? Well, here we have that emergency. If you want to stock up on groceries, but you don't have enough money in the bank account and you don't know if you're going to get your next paycheck either because things are shutting down, you're going to suffer. Biden did not want to come close to that systemic economic reason that Americans are wholly unprepared for this pandemic.
So let's take another piece of this, which has to do with climate change. And I'm going to come back to how this may kind of affect this entire election and where these movements may be taking us in this country. But let's take a piece of the argument around climate change, which I think is also indicative of the divide here.
Number one, no more subsidies for fossil fuel industry, no more drilling on federal lands, no more drilling, including offshore, no ability for the oil industry to continue to drill, period. Ends. Number one.
Obviously, the Paris Accord is useful, but it doesn't go anywhere. If you laugh at Joe, then you're missing the point. This is an existential crisis.
Bingo.
You talk about, I'm talking about stopping fracking as soon as we possibly can. I'm talking about telling the fossil fuel industry that they are going to stop destroying this planet. No ifs, buts, and maybes about it. I'm talking about speaking to China. Well, I'm not sure your proposal does that. I'm talking about speaking to China, to Russia, to countries all over the world. And in this moment, making the point that instead of spending $1.8 trillion on weapons of destruction designed to kill each other, maybe we should pool our resources and fight our common enemy, which is climate change. I know your heart is in the right place, but this requires dramatic, bold action.
So, it seems as if when you look at the polls that most Democrats are maybe emotionally and even ideologically in some ways with Bernie Sanders in terms of what they believe should happen in America. But when you look at the vote, people are going pragmatically, quote unquote, for Biden because they're terrified of what lies ahead and don't think that Sanders how they can win. And also we have this bogeyman we may talk about later if we have time, what the word socialism, what that means, what that conjures up for people. So to me, part of what they were arguing here goes to the heart of that. And I think that's at the heart of this divide.
Well, first of all, I'm so glad that climate change does get raised during Democratic debates these days. And we have to thank candidates like Sanders, like Elizabeth Warren, and all of the progressive movements, social movements that have pushed even their campaigns to make this a priority. There was a time when Democratic debates did not even raise the issue of climate change. If at all, it might have been an afterthought or candidates might have had to raise it themselves. So for one thing, I think that Sanders's candidacy is both 2016 and this time have pushed the entire conversation to the left, and that is a good thing. On the issue of pragmatism and, being worried about electability and what socialism means, I actually think most Americans are okay with the idea, especially Democrats are quite okay with the idea of socialism. Polls have shown that. But I think the problem here is everyone's a political pundit. Everyone is trying to pick the candidate that they think is going to be the most electable. And who is informing those views? It's the corporate media. The corporate media has beat the drumbeat for Joe Biden for a long time. They did it last year when his poll numbers were up, when Biden kind of embarrassed himself and got taken down by Kamala Harris. His poll numbers went down because the corporate media backed off. And when Sanders started consolidating his power and winning primaries, that's when Biden got thrust into the spotlight again. And all it took was a few key endorsements from a few key people to get the media, rushing behind Biden and convincing everybody that he is the more electable candidate, even though poll after poll showed that in head-to-head matchups, Sanders did beat Trump, and in many polls beat him with a bigger margin than Biden could have beaten him. So this issue of electability and who we think will be best poised to beat Trump is informed by this idea that we can predict the future, we can predict polls, and we're trying to be political pundits. But in the primaries is where we should be voting our heart and our ideals. In the general election is where strategic voting makes more sense. And I'm really disappointed that things have turned out this way.
So to get to the point here, to really, for the two of us to talk for a moment about where this may take us from now to November and where this country is going, let me say this really small clip here. About when they were both asked a question about, I think, if I have it right, Sanders was asked the question, how come you can't win black voters? And Biden was asked the question, why can't you win Latino voters? Let's watch this for just a second.
Senator Sanders has won more of the Hispanic vote than you in several key states so far. In fact, he doubled your support in California among Hispanics. He almost tripled it in Nevada. So why is your message not resonating with Hispanic voters?
Well, look, my message is resonating across the board. Every single state we've been in, there's been a significant turnout. In Virginia, turnout was up 70%. They voted for me. He didn't bring them out. I brought them out.
You're struggling to gain wide support from African Americans. Why is your message not resonating with African American voters?
I think it's imperative that we defeat Trump. I think our campaign of a biracial, bigenerational, multi-generational grassroots movement is the way to do it.
So, I mean, I know candidates all have to stick to their talking points and have difficulty kind of wrestling with some issues when they're fairly deep issues. But this is a serious issue here because we have this press in this country that makes this monolith about race. All black voters, all Latino voters, when, I mean, Latinos are so many communities and the black community is diverse. And it's divided by class and by region and by gender and by age. But I think all politicians seem to have a difficulty dealing with race and dealing with the complexity of race and racism in America. And that just showed they both do to me.
If I were Biden, I would have tried to answer that question to say, you're right, I've struggled with Latino voters in part because I haven't reached out to them, in part because I was part of an administration under which deportations were, record high, and in part because Latinos are more likely to be in favor of policies that I'm not putting forward, which is Medicare for all, canceling college debt, a higher federal minimum wage. If I was Sanders, I would have said something similar when in terms of the failure to win over enough black voters. He did not campaign as well as he could have in southern states as a lesson that he should have learned from 4 years ago. And he also failed to get endorsements from people like Jesse Jackson early enough in his candidacy. And he really should have been speaking more directly. It wasn't enough for him to have, we know now in hindsight, for him to have, a Nina Turner as his campaign co-chair. He should have been reaching out to who are very reliable Democratic voters, which are older black folks in southern states. These are folks who remember the struggle for voting rights in America, who religiously vote, who will, who for them it is a critically important civic duty to vote, and they turn out and they make pragmatic choices because they've had to, and Sanders failed to recognize that and failed to reach out to them enough. And of course, again, we have a media that's tilted deeply against Sanders, which I think has to play into any of the failings that he's had with older voters, because they might rely on more traditional means of media. Younger voters are more reliant on social media, and they've seen and resonated with his campaign, but they didn't turn out in as high numbers, it seems, according to some polls, to vote for Sanders.
So if you look at this, try to conclude here, if you look at this, where this is taking this country and taking the Democrats, let's say for argument's sake that the trends continue and that Biden becomes the candidate. And then you're taking on Trump and the forces around Trump. And there are a lot of people on the left and a lot of progressives saying, well, if it's Biden, I don't have anything to do with it. But the reality, to me at any rate, my analysis is, the reality is we're facing a very dangerous coalition of the far right in this country that can take us places that we don't understand. If you're black in America or Latino in America, if you lived through the 40s and 50s and 60s, you can understand what we could be facing if they gain complete control. At least that's how I see this battle. So maybe you agree or disagree, but I'm just curious your thoughts on that and where you see this taking this campaign between now and November.
Yeah, I think that you're right. I mean, I think it's quite terrifying to think about 4 more years of Trump. And it's very disappointing that the neoliberal wing of the Democratic Party has consolidated itself around a Biden candidacy, because Biden has decades of experience in the Senate and as vice president, and his record is available for all to examine. And we know that Trump is going to be able to go after him, no matter how far Biden is pushed to the left, which he definitely seems to have done. He's adopted Elizabeth Warren's college plan. He, during the debate last night, really spoke to a lot of issues that he hadn't spoken to before, in a testament to his acknowledgement that Democratic voters and Americans want something a lot more to the left of what he's been proposing. But he's going to be destroyed in the general election by Trump, who's going to be able to easily look back on his record for decades and show that he voted and wholeheartedly backed the Iraq War, that he voted to and lobbied heavily to cut Social Security, and on, all of the things that Sanders said. When push comes to shove, whoever is in office starting next January, if it's either Biden or Trump, unfortunately, we're going to have to work harder than ever to push them to take on policies that we know this country desperately needs. If it's Trump, I can't even predict what the next 4 years are going to be. I can't even acknowledge that, I don't even know if this country will survive another 4 years of Trump. If Biden is in office, the movement that Sanders has coalesced under him needs to be out in full force to push Biden to keep the promises that he made at last night's debate. He made some ambitious promises like no more offshore or onshore oil drilling, right? So that movement is going to be more necessary than ever to push Biden, if he becomes president, to keep any promises he's made, and to really lay down the gauntlet that neoliberal capitalism has seen its end. We can't survive another pandemic like what we're going through right now if we stick to the establishment Democratic Party's plan to, deregulate, to eviscerate social safety nets, which is just basically a light version of what Republicans have pushed for years.
So let me conclude with this, and we're butting up against our time here, but very quickly, this, to me, when I watch this Sanders campaign, and I watch this being built around this campaign, it is all folks around the Democratic Party for the most part, but it is also one of the largest left movements I've seen in this country ever coalesce, in terms of its sheer numbers and the ideas changing among the American public. I saw it go from the 30s to the 60s to where we are now, and people didn't expect it. But let me just close with this, to talk about that for a moment. But in the context, if Sanders was to be the candidate, what they did to him last night in terms of red baiting could be coming next.
There are about 1.5 million Cuban Americans living in Florida right now. Why would they vote for you when they hear you praise a program of Fidel Castro, a dictator who jailed, tortured, and killed thousands of Cubans?
I have opposed authoritarianism, whether it's in Cuba, whether it's in Saudi Arabia, whether it's in China, or whether it is in Russia.
To be clear, Senator Sanders, Cuba has been a dictatorship for decades. Shouldn't we judge dictators by the violation of human rights and not by any of their alleged achievements?
Well, I think you can make the same point about China. China is undoubtedly an authoritarian society, okay? But would anybody deny, any economists deny, that extreme poverty in China today is much less than what it was 40 or 50 years ago? That's a fact. So I think we condemn authoritarianism, whether it's in China, Russia, Cuba, any place else. But to simply say that nothing ever done by any of those administrations had a positive impact on their people would, I think, be incorrect.
The praising of the Sandinistas, the praising of Cuba, the praising just now of China. China is an authoritarian dictatorship. That's what it is. We have to deal with them because they're there. But the idea that they, in fact, have increased the wealth of people in that country, it's been marginal, the change that's taken place.
So, Sonali, in conclusion, what do you say?
Well, first of all, for Biden to criticize China, criticize Sanders' position on China is ridiculous. And in the Obama administration, had no problem embracing Chinese capitalism, no problem, enabling American corporations to move all of their labor and their materials and their factories to China. So the Democrats like Biden speak out of both sides of their mouth when it comes to countries like China. But I think Sanders' answer was on point. But also, remember, who asked the question about Cuba? It was the questioner. It was the CNN or Univision host.
Right.
And this is, corporate media loves to, and I'm talking about liberal corporate media, loves to fan the flames of the communist authoritarian dictator almost as much as Fox News does. They're the ones who consistently bring up, they're the ones who have incredibly biased coverage of Venezuela, of Cuba. These are the countries these are the companies, that run the Washington Post and all of the other corporate media outlets, CNN included, that are pushing the red baiting strategy and that kind of, incredibly dishonest narrative around who should be trusted and who shouldn't. They are pushing hard against any kind of social services and any discussion around social safety nets and democratic socialism by shutting down discussion, by raising the issue of praise for Cuba, praise for Venezuela, praise for China, and not allowing an actual conversation about what some of these countries might get right. Sanders can make himself hoarse saying that he does not believe in authoritarian governments, but they won't listen. I wish he had also brought up India, which has an authoritarian government, Brazil, which has an authoritarian government. These are allies of the U.S. Britain's prime minister is veering on authoritarian. There are some European heads of state that are deeply authoritarian, and I wish Sanders had brought them up as well. So we do need to talk about these things, but the corporate media makes the debate very, very narrow. We can't allow them to set the constraints of the debate.
Well, Sonali, Kolhatkar, thank you so much, and well put. Good to have you with us, and let me encourage everybody to check out Rising Up with Sonali. It's an incredible program, and thank you for being with us today.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Mark. Thank you so much for all the work you do as well.
Take care. And I'm Mark Steiner here with the Real News Network. Please let us know what you think. It's just beginning. Take care.
Thanks a lot for watching. Appreciate it. But do us one more solemn favor. Hit the subscribe button below. You know you want to. Stay up on the videos.